In Live on Live this Wednesday, I'm joined by historian, author, and political analyst Oleg Koptzeff with the American University of Paris to discuss the current situation with the war in Syria. Oleg, you're very welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, on Tuesday, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, said he was worried that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad could launch a new offensive to crush eastern Aleppo before US President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated on January the 20th. Now, just this afternoon, France added its voice to accusations that Syria and its allies are using the political uncertainty in the United States to launch total war against rebel-held areas in the country, and also that states opposed to the Assad regime will be meeting here in Paris soon. Now, let's just look. Is the effect of Donald Trump's election adding yet another layer to the Gordian knot that are the wars in Syria and Iraq?
Well, you said it very well. It's uncertainty. The Trump effect is not something that we can imagine in the near future. We don't know exactly on what side will Trump really be. Will he be a friend of Russia, as he was accused of being, as he obviously manifested himself, or will he simply be part of the system as it seems?
Fall into line.
Will he fall into line with the Republican system, with the entire governmental system, and especially the military-industrial lobby in the United States? Will he be simply taken over by the neoconservatives in the Republican Party? Maybe, maybe not. Since we can't actually answer the question clearly because Trump has been so ambiguous and so unclear throughout this entire campaign. This creates a great the foreign policy was absolutely absent from the debate. There was no serious description, just a few signs, not even a few slogans, but some hints
that relations with Russia would be better. That was always hinted, and there was even speculation that this bromance between Putin and Trump. But the two, of course, never met. So it was all rhetoric.
Rhetoric and just hints again, rather than any serious program that was recognizable during the campaign. So in this uncertainty, in this climate of uncertainty, all of the actors in Syria are trying to rush to finish the job that they have set to accomplish.
Now, let's just look at what came out just a little earlier this afternoon, that France's Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault said that there would be a meeting here in Paris of states opposed to Bashar al-Assad's regime. Now, let's just look quickly about what's happening in Aleppo, the siege of Aleppo. We're hearing about rebel-controlled areas in the city are being bombarded, etc. But let's just look at actually who is at play here. What happened to the Free Syrian Army, and what happened to the Syrian opposition in exile?
Well, we don't know exactly because they themselves probably don't know who they belong to, who they are loyal to or not, because it's a very unstable situation. I would say there is no one free Syrian army. There are different factions that change alliances between themselves. It goes from the most liberal, westernized intellectuals all the way to the extremist Islamists who are actually very close to, if not even aligned on, or even part of Al-Qaeda. But it changes all the time. That's the problem, is that it evolves rapidly. Now, that is why, in fact, the Russians simply prefer Bashar al-Assad. They feel safe with a dictator, preferably an authoritarian, bloody dictator, who will guarantee that there will be no religious factions, no Islamist groups taking over, or no chaos as we are, no democratically elected chaos as we are seeing it in Iraq. And the Kremlin has absolutely no moral objections to the methods used by someone like Assad. We're seeing it in Aleppo. The method that we're seeing in Aleppo is simply something we've seen in Algeria when the Islamist rebels or even terrorists were completely wiped out, but using the most extreme means, that is wiping out entire villages, entire
Sure.
populations. It's something like 250,000 victims, if not even much more, according to some analysts.
Well, this is true. In fairness, it's very hard for the United States and their allies to hold the high moral ground because of what happened in 2003, where we had a dictatorship decapitated. It was a very, very brutal dictatorship that was only keeping a cap on a very ethnically and culturally diverse country such as Iraq. And a lot of people can just say, well, look what happened there. But just speaking of, let's just say, the decapitation of regimes, let's just look to Libya. And former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came under fire about how the United States made potentially naive choices in backing groups to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi at the time. Now, have, in your opinion, the United States made the right choices in backing the right rebel groups in Syria, or will we ever know?
Well, again, the question is, what do you define as rebel groups in Syria?
Those who
are
may
we
have
talking
received
about?
U.S. money. This is the whole thing.
And
Because we always remember, we have to remember in Afghanistan, the CIA gave lots of money to Islamist groups who were fighting the Soviet occupation there, but those Islamist groups then evolved into Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which are now a direct threat, in many eyes, to the United States.
Which was not predictable at the time. In defense of United States policies in the 1980s, I would say that you could not see it coming.
But
I
now,
would say
have they learned from their mistakes, though?
The great mistake in Afghanistan was not to support Massoud all the way.
Indeed.
And on the contrary, even Massoud not only was not taken seriously until the very end, but he was even seen as someone not very desirable for American foreign policy. And then we saw the result. Now, of course, the United States should have learned its lesson, but the problem is that United States policy is always in the short term because
of the 4-year mandate.
Have not only a 4-year mandate, but you have elections every 2 years. So the problem is that we have congressmen who want rapid results, who want quick victories on the terrain. Within the next 2 years, because again, it's not every 4 years that there are elections, it's every 2 years since Congress is renewed every 2 years. So that is also why we have, I would say, many inconsistencies, great risks that are taken because we have short-term policies. Now, the Russians have long-term policies, but as I said, they're very, and policies that are very predictable. I would like to make a metaphor. The Americans give a big kick in there's a hornet's nest. Imagine a hornet's nest in areas like Iraq or Syria or Libya. They take a big stick and they start beating on the hornet's nest and hoping that one by one they'll swat all of the hornets that are flying out. The Russians give someone a big flamethrower and they just torch the hornet's nest with good hornets or bad hornets, and they just torch the entire area, even at the risk of torching the good bumblebees as well as the hornet's nest as well.
Now, let's just, I mean, that's an analogy I think that has been used for a long time as well. They just throwing a rock at a hornet's nest and look, there you go, Pandora's box has been opened. Now, let's just look at these talks that are being proposed here in Paris. Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, joined with German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier in calling for an end to the bombardment of civilians in Syria and a political solution to the conflict. Now, Russia, meanwhile, has accused de Mistura himself of torpedoing a Security Council resolution to revive peace talks between the regime and the opposition, because they're saying it was being torpedoed, and this was coming from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, that the resolution calls for holding inclusive Syrian talks without preconditions. Let's just look at Aleppo. There's been a quote saying, there was once a time to do something about Aleppo, but now it's too late. Is all lost for any negotiated resolution to the situation in Syria?
My impression is that, unfortunately, yes. I'm afraid that it's been decided in Damascus and in Moscow that the hornet's nest with all of the innocent bees' nests are going to be torched. Aleppo is going to be sacrificed with all of the innocent civilians in there being held hostage.
All 275,000.
All of these human shields. There's the Syrian army and the Russian armed forces that are supporting it are just not concerned by the human shields. They're going to get to their enemy no matter what the cost.
And this, of course, is the catch-22 for the people who are in Aleppo, because if they leave, they're scared of being captured by the pro-Assad forces or the government forces themselves for being tortured, for being complicit with the rebels. And if they stay, they're being bombarded on a regular basis with no food supplies or anything.
There's a cultural dimension that I want to add to it. There are a lot of Christians in Aleppo, a lot of Orthodox Christians.
I've been to Aleppo a few times. I knew it well.
Just like in Russia, like the majority of the Russian population is Orthodox. This is going to cost Russia in terms of soft power and of the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Eastern Christianity in general. It could create huge divisions. It's going to be extremely costly in the long term.
Now, one final question I'd like to put to you, Oleg. It's a bit of a curveball, but it's something that came out quite recent, is that Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has expressed support for Assad's military. What implications could this have? Because Egypt, Cairo and Riyadh, it's in Saudi Arabia, Egypt is the biggest recipient of Saudi aid in the region. However, they're both diametrically opposed here. If they will now be diametrically opposed because it's the Saudis who are very much against the Assad government. What repercussions will this move now have?
I would say it could recreate a solidarity between regimes that, in fact, have both originated in the Ba'ath secular socialist nationalist Arab tradition that we had in the days of Nasser and Hafez al-Assad, the father of President Bashar al-Assad. That would be almost normal. I would say it's something recognizable for the populations of Egypt and Syria. To them, it would almost be a sort of a restoration.
A return to the status quo.
Exactly, and nor even more than return to a status quo, a stabilization. Because after all, the region was, or not in Israel, Palestine, but in Syria, Egypt, and Libya, the situation was rather stable when Ba'athist regimes were in power. Not that this was very good for human rights, of course, but the general impression was that these were strong, stable regimes. And I think that is the essential motivation of Bashar al-Assad. It's to be sure that it stays that way, that it doesn't disappear, to be replaced by the kind of dysfunctional democracy that we see in Iraq. I'm not saying that I'm against democracy, but unfortunately, unfortunately, it's dysfunctional in Iraq at the moment.
Well, you're throwing a political system on a culture that have never had anything but strongman politics, really.
Honestly, I defend human rights and I teach human rights in my university, and I don't believe in that. That's an argument that's very often used against Russia, that Russia has a culture that is incompatible with human rights. So let's not say that about the Arabs either. I personally, but this is a personal opinion, I do believe that democracy and human rights are applicable to all civilizations, but not the way it's being imposed by intrigue and force and extremely complex and ambiguous military or operations, or even that you could call neo-colonial adventures. Neo-colonial adventures, whether they're Western or Russian.
Okay, Oleg Koptzeff, historian, author, and political analyst with the American University of Paris. Thank you very much for being on the program today.
Thank you.